Good afternoon. Thank you for being here and welcome to our first virtual webinar. I'm Nikki Martin, the Section Director of APA Central Ohio, and I'm pleased to introduce Parks Are an Essential Business, presented by Chris Herman and Andrew Overbeck, both of whom are principal planners with MKSK in Columbus, Ohio. Both Chris and Andrew are AICP certified and are active with APA Ohio. Their work has been recognized at the local, state, and national levels, including work like downtown planning, comprehensive planning, and parks planning. Without further ado, Chris and Andrew.
Thank you, Nikki, and we're glad to be here with you all here at this lunch hour. We did a version of this presentation about a month ago for ULI Columbus. Stemming from observations and lessons learned that we had from the pandemic and things that we thought were ripe for further discussion, and how parks and open space, were not equitably allocated throughout our communities, and what can we do about that, and what had COVID-19 taught us about how people use public space, and how can we improve the equitable access to that public space. In the intervening month, a lot of our statistics in our presentation needed to be updated.
That's right.
And we also have observations from the recent social unrest that's taken place across the country that we felt like needed to be addressed today. So we've made some updates in the last month to this work that we've done, and we're going to highlight a few trends at the very beginning, and then look at Columbus, City of Columbus as a case study.
Yep.
We have had the great pleasure to work with the Recreation and Parks Department on both the comprehensive plan for the City of Columbus, Parks and Recreation Department, and most recently a land plan that looks at how can Columbus have walkable park access for every single resident in the city. So that's our primary data that we want to share with you all, and then really looking at what the future could look like if that plan is implemented. So a way to improve equitable access to open space, and we'll start off by going through a few of these lessons learned from both the pandemic and the recent social unrest.
Two quick things to add. One is, I think a lot of the things that we're going to talk about in Columbus apply to our other cities in Ohio, so I think there's takeaways for everyone. The other is just quick housekeeping. Feel free to ask questions in chat. We can't see it until the end, so we are going to go through this, then we're going to have a good, robust Q&A at the end. So ask your questions as you think of them in chat, and then we will go through them at the end of the presentation.
Great, thanks, Chris. We'll start off by talking about some of the things that we've observed that are incredibly important from the social unrest and conversations that are now thankfully happening in our communities. And I think it really boils down to social equity and implicit bias. And if we create park spaces in our communities and they aren't accessible physically, that's not a good thing. But it's also not a good thing if people don't feel welcome in those public spaces, if they're treated differently because of the color of their skin in those public spaces, then they just about don't have access to those public spaces either. So acknowledging those two things is incredibly important in the work that we all do as planners, and ensuring that that those spaces feel welcoming to all. And it's not just a matter of how we feel. It's a matter of life and death in a lot of cases. Ahmaud Arbery was just going for a run and trying to get some exercise, and wound up being killed. We have Christian Cooper in New York City, in Central Park, who was doing, of all the innocuous things you could possibly do in a park, bird watching
On a regular basis.
And he was accosted by a white woman and made to feel uncomfortable being there. So these things are happening on a small scale, a large scale across our country. We've been sort of keeping an eye on social media and people sharing their stories and experiences, and this is one man's experience in his neighborhood. basically expressing that he doesn't feel comfortable walking around his own neighborhood without one of his daughters with him. If he's by himself, he feels like he's got a bit of a target on his back. So we know that there's implicit bias and there's racism and there's equitable access from a social standpoint that we need to do a better job of as a society. I think one of my sort of more interesting stories that Mayor Mike Coleman here in Columbus told, shared this anecdote at the opening of the Sato Greenways in downtown Columbus. And here he is at Coleman's Point in the middle of that project. And he shared the anecdote that, and he did it with a bit of a sense of humor, but there's a really salient point behind his story that I think is something we all have to acknowledge. And this was toward the end of the construction of this project. So there was, some pretty good gaps in construction fence. And Mayor Coleman had a hoodie on and was going for a jog downtown. And he decided to stop at Coleman's Point and look at the progress of the project, and sort of snuck in through one of the construction fences, had a seat, and was sort of taking it all in when he was confronted by a security guard and asked to leave. The security guard, of course, was surprised to learn that he had walked up to the mayor and, of course, apologized. But, it sort of goes to show that unequal treatment in our public spaces is a real issue. I think on a positive note, we are seeing that our public spaces are a place for public discourse. And thankfully, here in Columbus anyway, the police, after a few nights of not getting it right, let people protest peacefully and let them have the streets. But our public spaces in our cities are places that we should be able to come together as a community and express our free ideas and protest. And thankfully, that's happening in a lot of places. Also in Louisville, where Breonna Taylor has been memorialized at Jefferson Square, where that's been the center of their protests. And we're starting to see communities sort of rally and come together. These are images of some of the art that's been created in Columbus, covering up some of the boarded up windows and sharing, I think, moments of reflection for everyone to sort of take in as we work together to build a better society, and knowing that work is just beginning. So before we pivot sort of a hard right to COVID, we wanted to acknowledge that these are issues and they expose faults in our communities just as much as COVID has, and they need to be acknowledged and addressed as well. So now Chris is going to go through lessons learned from the pandemic.
Thanks, Andrew. So yeah, before even the round of protests and some of this injustice is exposed again, we were all talking about COVID, and we're coming back to talking about all of this at the same time. We all realize, I think, as planners, that COVID pandemic is having a crippling impact on our lives and our mortality and on our economy and livelihood, but it is also impacting our physical and mental health. So you can see from this slide, the pandemic is putting in sharp relief the social issues that already existed, and it's shining a spotlight on things like structural inequality. And it's not advancing.
You want to do it?
So one way we are seeing this is in a disproportionate impact on groups. We all have heard how older people are more susceptible, but we're also seeing the African-American communities are as well. And so this represents a disproportionate percentage of deaths per infection. I think it's gotten more and more coverage over this last month since we presented before, and that's a good thing. And this is for a number of reasons, and we all know about these, but it really includes the historical locational inequities that have manifested in population health. It's working. Okay, good, thank you. Again, before COVID times, we knew in Columbus, and I think in other cities in Ohio, that we have neighborhoods of high vulnerability. And this is a map from Kirwan Institute at Ohio State. You can see how the greater prosperity of Central Ohio has not been shared or experienced equally throughout Central Ohio. And one of the striking statistics is that if you live in one of these neighborhoods, your life expectancy is 26 years lower than the metro average. That is stunning, and it's not acceptable. None of us think it's acceptable. Here in Columbus, Mayor Ginther and his administration and the city are making efforts to identify and address issues in these low opportunity neighborhoods. They're a major focus of the administration. Again, as we all know, our health is determined by a number of factors. This includes our genetics and eating habits and lifestyles, but our physical environment plays an important role. That includes our built environment and our natural environment and our work and neighborhood settings. While people talk qualitatively about the health benefits of parks, there's a growing volume of quantitative data that highlights the positive physical and mental impacts of parks on people's health. We had actually a lot of slides on this, but we cut them down. But if you go and look, there's now a lot of resources and statistics that talk about data showing the benefits of park spaces. So think about this. Roughly 0.2% of people infected with COVID are dying, but data shows that we could prevent a full 10% of premature deaths with more physical exercise. So while we're all rightly worried and upset about COVID impacts on our health and well-being and our economy, we've always had this issue of premature deaths and the point that we're not getting enough physical exercise as a society, and we need to be addressing this, and parks play an essential role in that. Again, you can see $177 billion in annual healthcare costs are associated with inadequate physical activity. So we need to, as a country, as planners, be advocating for people to get out and be more physical, and parks are an essential part of that. We also need to recognize that health benefits span demographics. They accrue regardless of age. There are benefits for every single age group, and this is just an example. From children to adults, you can see these benefits accrue. So now let's talk a little bit about, since we recognize that parks are beneficial, and perhaps even more critically so today, are they equitable? And that's a big thing that's been brought up with this COVID pandemic. So here are two parks in Columbus, side by side. The Three Rivers neighborhood on the left and Joan Park in Linden on the right. These parks are about the same size, they're about 5 acres. One has all types of amenities that were part of a recent update, while the other is pretty much what you see is what you get. And this is not a critique of the city of Columbus or Rec and Parks. It's the reality that we have limited budgets, and we are trying as a city to methodically work through our parks and upgrade them. But by the time you get around to the last one, it's time to go back, and years, decades have passed before you can get to the next one. So it is an issue. The city's been working hard to upgrade these, but it takes resources. We all realize that. So there's already a challenge in doing this, and now with the impact of COVID on the economy and on municipal budgets, I think we're seeing that there's going to be even more impact going forward. But surely we have all experienced in these past weeks that parks are essential, and they are essential business that must be funded. Similarly, and this is an important point, I think you probably saw it here in the early slides, when we're talking about parks and public space, we don't just mean the natural parks or the recreation parks. We mean, the public spaces in our downtowns. We mean the streets that connect our parks. These are public ways, public rights of ways, and should serve as linear parks. So this is right next to, the one on the right is right next to Joan Park. And that's a picture of Hudson Street. So that's the way that people get to Joan Park. And on the right, on the left, is Brevoort Road in Clintonville. And you can see the stark differences here. So these are two streets that access parks, and one has sidewalks, a tree lawn, street trees, street lights, on-street parking, all things that make a comfortable and safe pedestrian environment. And the other one has none of this. So you look at that pedestrian walking along Hudson Street on the edge of the street, and you think, is this safe and inviting? Would it be at dusk? Would you let your children go to the park, even if it was a fantastic park, via the street, if this was the access on their own? It's environments like this one on the right that cause actual physiological stress. The positive outcomes that we're talking about being conferred by the park spaces are negated when we travel through this type of environment. And if this is the quality of access that exists, one is less likely to go to the park in the first place. Also, our trails are a really important resource. That's a good exercise, and all our communities are recognizing that we need to create better trail systems, multi-use trail systems. And this is, contrasting two different types of trails that we have here in Central Ohio. The one on the left is Olentangy Trail, and it's one of our original and well-loved trails, and it's probably, in fact, once was a national model, I believe 40 years ago. And you can see it's wide enough to practice some social physical distancing. It's embedded in nature. It serves as a great linear park space. At the same time, it's become so popular now that we have bicyclists and dog walkers and joggers and parents with strollers, all competing for the same space. So now we need to think about, widening this trail system to accommodate all those different modes. And so that's something we need to worry about. And our river trails like Olentangy are still superior to trails like the one on the right. Now, I'm not criticizing this in terms of the fact that we need to have more east-west trails in Central Ohio, and they're really hard to come by. But again, you can see that it would be nice to do more things to this trail. It's narrow, it's fenced in, there's no trees and vegetation, and again, it creates that stressful environment that leans towards that Hudson Street example that we were showing before. So we need to think about how we improve our trail connections as well. This is an interesting piece. I think we've been talking about this. This was from the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis at OSU. Did a study on traffic speeds since COVID started, and particularly when people were sheltering home, those people that are out on the roads were absolutely going faster. And those faster traffic was increasing crash rates and actually increasing the severity of those crashes, and not just people in the cars, but things that people were driving those cars at that speed. So this is another thing we have to worry about. And again, it's something as planners we know, the whole idea of Vision Zero, but this just continues to emphasize that speed and traffic focus are not beneficial to population, particularly those walking and riding and trying to use our park system. And then on the first really nice April weekend, we went out and took pictures at different parks around town. And it was beautiful, and everyone was out trying to escape their homes and enjoy the weather. And as you can imagine, we observed maintaining physical distance in small park spaces, and even the sidewalks or paths getting there was an immediate challenge. However, in our larger parks, and this is Whetstone here, there's ample space for people to practice social distancing in a stress-free natural environment. So you can see how people were there if you look at the upper right picture there of the parking and the cars that aren't practicing physical distancing, but you can see that there's plenty of space for everyone to enjoy and get out. This is the side of Mile, right downtown. You see in previous pictures. And similarly, people were able to find space. It's a large linear park. You can use all different kinds of modes and still really enjoy that space. So we have changed and adapted our physical environments in the past in response to pandemics and outbreaks. Parks like Central Park had their inception in response to such things as cholera and tuberculosis. Now, what will our response be to this generational crisis? What opportunities is this providing us as planners to think about how we shape and mold our cities? Really, I think what we're hoping you take away from this is that green space is a prerequisite for sound collective health. Andrew.
Great, thanks, Chris.
Yep.
I think it's worth mentioning to give a little bit of credit to the city of Columbus here that the example we showed on Hudson Street is being worked on currently with a multi-use path that's slated to be implemented, and the downtown connector also has some design work going on. So the city is recognizing those issues and working on them. So wanted to also just do a quick look at how cities and park systems are responding actually to both issues, both the social unrest and to the pandemic. There's been a lot of sort of on-the-fly thinking that's needed to take place. But it's what's great to see is the community is taking charge of some of that as well. This is the Olentangy Trail in Clintonville, a giant mural that a private property owner has put on put on his fence. 1 million trail users a year on this trail, and he added Dr. Fauci to the mural. So good to have some acknowledgement of his hard work. But we know that we're working more as those of us who are working from home. We're using Zoom a lot. We're working more hours per week. But we're also doing things like buying dogs and purchasing bikes, and we're getting outside more as well. These are just some statistics from around Cincinnati, down at the Hamilton County, Great Parks of Hamilton County system. They've seen a giant increase both in terms of visitors to parks, but also their trail users. And in Franklin County, we've seen a similar increase, although 60% increase in visits to metro parks. And I know from talking to some folks up in Northeast Ohio that Summit County Metro Parks has seen similar increases of about 30% in visitorship. So we know people are trying to get out to these big open spaces and be outside, and that's really important. And in fact, the CDC, even though we have COVID-19 happening and the pandemic and the risks involved with that, they recommend that people get outside. They recommend that people stay physically active through this crisis, and they've altered their recommendations now. These are a little bit different than the ones we had a couple weeks ago, and they're still recommending social distancing, but now are recommending careful use of other things like playgrounds and swimming pools, although cities have been a little slower to come to that same realization as meeting some of those requirements is pretty difficult if you look at it. So this is recently from Columbus. They've started to reopen some things like tennis courts and pickleball courts here shortly. Still have things closed like basketball courts and disc golf courses because they require a little more physical contact. And we may get to pools and aquatic centers and spray grounds, but some work still to be done on that. So things are slowly starting to reopen, but again, the big events and things that require or lead to close human interaction are still not allowed.
And Angie, if I might interject really quickly, he mentioned that we had to update these slides because it's changed in the last month. And I think one thing we all need to recognize as planners is in the fall, based on what we're hearing, we may have to go back to some of these things. So we do need to keep lessons learned in mind and think about that and be prepared for changes in either direction as we move forward.
Yeah, it's not a one-way street here. And enabling social distance. So this is, I think everyone's seen these pictures. Other cities have done this. This is in Brooklyn at Domino Park, I think. A lot of cities have started to put these things out. But I think one of the things that we've also seen and seen reported on are some of these social distance rules are being enforced unequally. This is a story that was in the New York Daily News, a study that was done between March and May of the arrests that were made in Brooklyn for social distancing infractions, and majority of those, preponderance of those are Black or Hispanic in nature. So how are we enforcing these rules in public spaces? And this has long been a problem in our cities, but we're seeing it writ large here, and I think we can no longer hide from it. Pedestrian space is incredibly important. So this goes beyond our public spaces to our streets, the public realm. This is a pedestrian advocate in Toronto, sort of illustrating what a 6-foot radius looks like. And that's a wide sidewalk. You can see how much space that takes up. So a lot of cities have started to look at how can we reallocate space between building face and building face and create more space for pedestrians, bicyclists, etc. Milan, given how hard Italy was hit by COVID, they were some of the first to respond to this, and they've gone ahead and created a sort of a guidebook on how to do it, and have been implementing these systems across the city. So a great example of that, and NACTO has recently put out some guidelines as well for a variety of different solutions, whether it's larger bike lanes, larger sidewalks, but also how can you expand outdoor dining and other things to allow for businesses to reopen when they aren't allowed to have indoor seating. So a lot of different ways to start to think, I think, very positively about the reallocation of space in our cities. But we know, again, that some don't feel welcome in those spaces, and there's been a lot of great perspective and criticism of these efforts. I think an article I highly recommend everyone read is the one on the right. Safe streets are not safe for Black lives, and it's really important to sort of take these things into account. Definitely some noise on Twitter in the past couple of days. This picture of people in sort of a parklit outdoor dining, having brunch while protesters go by, started sort of a bit of an outrage and conversation online. So there's a lot of conversation happening around this. It's incredibly important, and we need to make sure as planners that these spaces we're creating are for all people, not just for some people. And and sometimes it's perception, and sometimes it's because we haven't asked the right questions. City of Oakland was one of the first to really dig into this issue and act very quickly. And they started a slow streets program back in April. And so far, they've installed 20 miles of slow streets along 19 corridors. You can see pretty equitably spread across the city. But they received a lot of criticism and pushback from different communities. And they've had to pivot. I think they've pivoted well. And what they've concentrated on are now what they're calling essential places. And that these open streets or slow streets networks are ones that need to connect people to jobs, need to connect people to schools, need to connect people to grocery stores, testing sites, hospitals. So they're really trying to prioritize those. And then ensuring that any new installation of a slow street be the result of extensive community engagement in both low-income neighborhoods and communities of color, so that their voices are heard and things that are implemented are reflective of the things that they need. So again, we need to keep all of those voices in mind and ensure that everything that's being put in place is accessible to all and reflective of their needs. So now I want to get to our case study on Columbus. We were fortunate to work with the City of Columbus on both a comprehensive plan in 2014 and a land plan last year. And all of you, I think, are probably familiar with Trust for Public Land and the annual PARKSCORE that they put out. Columbus is sort of always in the sort of middle of the pack. And in fact, I think a recent study just came out, so I need to update this slide as well. But basically it shows in the red areas, orange areas where we've got a level of park need, and in green areas that are currently well served. When we did the land plan, we took their approach and refined it a little bit and looked at access points to trailheads and access points to parks, not just sort of centers of parks and sort of random points along a trail system. So that allows us to dig in a little bit deeper, have some mapping and some strategies that are very place specific and neighborhood specific, and allows us to look at the impact of both partners like metro parks and also potential facilities that we could add to the system and what problems they would solve. So again, we're looking at trying to improve access for Columbus residents to be within a 10-minute walk shed of existing park or trail. And that's really the goal of the city through this process. So these are our existing conditions after running that analysis along with recreational parks. And you can see that 35.5% of Columbus residents are outside that walk shed. So that's our target to reduce. And those areas are shown in red. So the areas in green are the ones that are well covered, and the areas in red are the ones that are not. And I think it's really important to think about how the city has grown since 1950. This is the 1950 boundary of the city on this slide. And you can see that as we grew, while there's still some red areas here that need to be addressed, this is largely green and largely well covered. And the areas that are red, in all honesty, were sort of traditionally industrial areas. So not terribly surprising where there is some red here in that 1950 boundary. But you can see as the city continued to grow, investment in parks and open spaces did not keep pace. And that's really the concern that we have and the problem that we're trying to solve. We also looked as part of that work at how different metrics sort of indicators overlaid on that story. And you can see here that these neighborhoods of social vulnerability that we introduced before, they're the ones that have, to a large degree, unequal access to parks and open space. And so we're focused really on trying to help those neighborhoods and do some work there to acquire property to ensure that they have access. And one of the things that we're really concerned about is even if we put a park in some of these areas, there are also the parts of the city that have the biggest gaps in sidewalks. So just the basic city services, forget bike lanes and green infrastructure and all those things. These neighborhoods don't have sidewalks in them. They don't have the ability to walk from one place to the other safely. So even if we put a park in, if we're not fixing these sidewalk gaps, we're not doing our job. There are the places then it's not terribly surprising that we have a high degree of pedestrian accidents in our city. Lack of sidewalks equals lack of safety. It's not terribly surprising that happens, but it disproportionately impacts a lot of these neighborhoods as well. And you see that in terms of the bike safety. Clearly on both of these maps, you're seeing sort of the density of sort of High Street and downtown through the campus area. Makes sense that those areas show up pretty densely, but these other neighborhoods that lack these critical street and sidewalk infrastructure are also the ones that are suffering disproportionately from a safety perspective. Our MORPC puts out every year, or updates every year, a bike level of stress bike comfort map. Here you see again the red areas are the more stressful streets, and those are also pretty concentrated in these neighborhoods of vulnerability as well. But the city's doing some things to fix this. In 5 neighborhoods across the city, they're putting in low stress bikeways, neighborhood bikeways. And these provide access to schools, to churches, to gathering places in the community, whether it's a cluster of businesses, libraries, community centers, parks. The goal is to create a low stress network that connects residents to points in their neighborhood that they need to be able to get access to, and in a few cases also provides access to the regional trail network. So the city is working to improve these pieces. I am on the planning. I'm the head of the CLINTONVILLE Area Commission's Planning and Development Committee. We were able to get a grant from our Urban Infrastructure Recovery Fund to put in bike boulevards and a neighborhood bikeway in Clintonville. Probably the most extensive network of all of these to date, but again, working on these east-west connections between the Olentangy Trail that's sort of shown in green and different points in the neighborhood, whether it's schools, farmers market, library, community center, to try and link those up as best as we can. And people are out using this as much as they possibly can these days. Our local bike shops in the neighborhood are having trouble keeping bikes in stock at this point. So people are getting out and using these spaces, and across the city and all the neighborhoods, we need to be doing more of this. City is also working on a Vision Zero program that just kicked off, again, concentrating on all these safety issues and how to improve both access to transportation, but also safe and equitable access to transportation of all kinds. And MORPC as well is in the process of doing a few corridor studies. Northwest Corridor is the first one that's underway right now, but others to follow quickly. That will not just look at transportation, but also look at how development is shaped across the city and along these corridors to allow for a more equitable and denser development pattern that makes the best use of city resources. So again, this is really some important projects that start to overlay with the land plan and parks and open space to improve the city, and we're looking to sort of knit all of these things together as best we can. So knitting these things together is really what the future looks like, and that's what I want to spend our last few minutes here together on, is how can we take all of these different things that are going on in the city and overlay them with some other visions that people are having to create a Columbus that is more equitable. It does have park space in close proximity and access to all neighborhoods, and overlaid with a transportation system that does the same. And I think one point that gets lost in all of this is the environmental value of protecting these parks and open spaces, these river and stream corridors in our city. Parks are the way that we can do that. I know there's some that are concerned about how we have pathways along river corridors and trails, and so what's the impact of the sort of human footprint on that? But I think there's a way we can work together to minimize that. So the larger vision for Central Ohio is really being led by the Central Ohio Greenways Committee, a group that I'm a part of. I'm on that board as well. And it's got a vision for taking our 233 existing miles of multi-use path shown in the purple, and adding 500 miles to that, and that's what's shown in the orange. And that looks out to our 8-county region, and how can we create a transportation network and a trail network that connects all of these communities together. And we're making great strides there. These connections are being closed, and we need to now work on sort of these other municipalities and connecting to them, as well as our east-west connections throughout the city and throughout Central Ohio. The land plan, I mentioned before, we started to look at potential pieces of ground that could be added and potential trails that could be added, and the impact that those have could be really substantial. So you remember I said 35.5% of Columbus residents are outside of a 10-minute walk shed. If we implemented the land plan, all of those green areas, or all those red areas, some of them would turn to green, and we would reduce that from 35.5% to 21%. So almost 80% of the city would be within a 10-minute walk of a park or a trailhead. And that's really our goal as a city to put that together. And you can start to see how in some of these neighborhoods that right now are low opportunity neighborhoods in the city can really be changed impactfully by adding trails, adding green space. These provide connections to not just recreation options, but also employment, the services that people need, access to schools and other places in the community that they can get to now with a network like this. So really important to make these investments, and we're starting to make the case for how we do this from a policy standpoint and a funding standpoint. But when we look at how all these systems overlay, and we zoom out to just say, let's take the Franklin County border, and you can see how the city overlaps with that. And our Metro Park system shown in the dark green, and our river and stream corridors, the 5 river and stream corridors that run north-south through our city. Looking at how those overlap together, I think creates a very powerful message that regionally we can sign on to. And you start to look at overlaying those river and stream corridors with a trail network that's being visioned by Central Ohio Greenways. And you start to look at these river corridors now as maybe the defining portions of our city. Instead of holding in our mind this map of roadways, imagine a day where we looked at the city and thought about the city as an interconnected system of rivers and streams. And when we look at public ownership of these stream corridors, 50% of them are already in public ownership. So I think we can make great strides as a community as we start to overlay these efforts and work together on one vision that benefits all of us. It benefits us equitably. I think that's incredibly important, probably first and foremost. It is going to be, I think, from an economic standpoint, sort of the stamp that we put on the city and puts us sort of on the map. Environmentally, it's incredibly important. And then we know the mobility and health and wellness benefits that such a system could have. And providing access for students and schools, employees and businesses, residents and neighborhoods, access to cultural institutions, but most importantly, helping these low opportunity neighborhoods that right now are so disadvantaged sort of get a leg up and have access to the same things that other neighborhoods throughout Central Ohio have. So I think, taken together, we really think this system, cooperating regionally through Metro Parks, the City of Columbus, MORPC, Central Ohio Greenways, we can create a network that improves access to schools, jobs, activity centers, and help these low opportunity neighborhoods get the access they so dearly need from all the levels we've talked about, from equity, from health, access to jobs, access to services. All of these things are incredibly important as we look forward. So our system tomorrow, would look to take that 10-minute walk shed idea and look a little bit bigger, look at the countywide scale in creating access for everyone throughout Franklin County and the city of Columbus. I think as we close here today, it's important to acknowledge that all of these issues we've talked about, they existed before the pandemic hit. They've existed every single time we've protested in the past. Yep. These protests, I hope, are taking a stronger hold and leading hopefully to the systemic changes that are necessary. But I think what both of these things have taught us in the last 3.5 months is that we have gaps in our community. We have gaps in everyday livability, and that's probably a simplistic way to think about it, but I think it's a simple way to think about it. If we can make all of our communities more livable, we create community resilience. I think this quote from Tom Vanderbilt really sums it up well. He was referring more in his thinking to streets, but I think that can equally be applied to all of our public infrastructure, all of our social infrastructure across our cities. So that's the challenge I think we have laid out for ourselves, and that's a challenge I think as planners we're taking on every day. But the importance is greater today, I feel like, than it's ever been before. So with that, we will stop, and we've got looks like at least 15 minutes here for Q&A.
Great, thank you. The voice you're hearing now is Christine Dursey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of APA Ohio, and my task is to help facilitate this Q&A. So let's get going here. First question, do the park access maps include the metro parks or just city parks?
That's a great question. Yeah, so they are, the city was really wanted to be, I think, pretty aggressive here and not be dependent on other partners. We ran the numbers both ways, but to sort of set the goal really high. They wanted to, we have, from a policy perspective in these maps, looked at just city-owned parks. And the reason there is we really wanted to set the bar really high. So yes, these maps that you see and all the data we share with you today are reflective of just City of Columbus parks.
And some thought that metro parks are more regional parks and then trying to have neighborhood local parks. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think that's not to say, and this is sort of a zoom in on one particular section, but if you look at sort of the northeastern part of the city, there's a couple metro parks up there, and clearly linking through some of those parks and connecting them is part of the strategy. So from a numbers perspective, yes, it's City of Columbus, but from a strategy process, those connections through and to metro parks where they create linkages is part of the plan.
Okay, great. Next question. Okay, we have a definition question. Could you explain the characteristics of a low stress bikeway?
Yeah. So typically, when we were doing the system in my neighborhood, we were trying to find streets that were low speed, so 25 miles an hour. We were looking at streets that had fewer than 1,500 cars per day. And I think those were pretty much the categories. And then we were also looking at where we could, and I think this is essential, where we could safely cross the dangerous streets. So High Street, 5 lanes, 35 miles an hour traffic. We selected intersections where we had stoplights and put in the stage 2 ladder crosswalks at those locations so that they're a little more highly visible. So those crossing points of those streets are just as important, I think, as the overall network, because a dangerous intersection is really the weak link, and if you've got a weak link, you don't have a low stress network. So those are the primary characteristics that we were looking at in creating that network, and I believe that's what the city's done in other parts of the city as well.
And Andrew, we're really talking about biking on street, right?
Yes, we're talking about biking on street. We're not, very uncomplicated. The bike boulevard markings are the most extensive. Sharrows come next, and then the parts of it that are really quiet, super neighborhood streets that aren't really are really carrying incredibly local traffic, just get signage. So I think if we, had our druthers, we probably would have turned some stop signs and put up some things that kept cars from accessing certain streets or being able to make turns. Some cities have taken a little more extensive approach to that. So I'd say ours are sort of maybe neighborhood bikeways or neighborhood greenways light, if you look at it that way, but it's been incredibly popular and well used.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Is there a movement in let's start with the city of Columbus, to shut down certain streets to motorized vehicles and reserve them for pedestrians and more active transportation? We've seen national examples of this, and I know that I think up here in Cleveland, at least, I've been hearing, rumblings about that kind of stuff. So could you speak to that when it comes to Columbus? And then if you have any other best practice examples that you could share with us, that would be great.
So yeah, I think in Columbus, there is a number of advocates that are very interested in doing that and following some of the things you're seeing in leaders around the country and closing streets, particularly in shelter-in-place COVID times. I think Columbus saw early what I think Oakland has realized, which is if you're going to do this, you better be equitable. And I think in some sense it was prescient to see that because of things that have happened more recently with the protests. But I think the point was that they wanted to be a little bit more, a lot more intentional and involve the community in these decisions. And so it wasn't something that they wanted to roll out in a week or 2 weeks like many other communities were. It was something that they wanted to have more of a process related to. And then I think we hit the point where we're starting to reopen, and then the pressure starts, reducing at that point. But I think all over, we all as communities need to be thinking about kind of overcapacity in our roadways and how we can balance public space. I mean, these right-of-ways are right-of-ways for all modes and for all of our communities, and how do we balance those?
Yeah, I really wish I could pitch this over to Justin Goodwin, who I know is listening in, working at the city right now. We had a lot more examples of this in our presentation we did a month ago. A lot of cities are doing this. So Oakland, I think has, I feel like, done the best job of balancing some of the criticism with some of the opportunity. So I definitely encourage you to go to their website, look at it. They've mapped it. They've got a criteria set up. They've got a process for engagement that I think has gotten stronger. So I think Oakland is a really phenomenal example. We helped the city of Louisville, our office down there, look at their Olmsted parks and closing down the interior roadways. So again, most of the access to those parks is from the edges, and that's where most of the parking is located. So they've shut down some of those interior roadways within the park to allow people to get into park space safely, and they still have those open through today. So they did that early on, and they're still open. That's not been without controversy and without some complaint, but I think when they can tell the story that, hey, here's how you access the park, and here's where the parking areas are, and the reason we're doing this is so that people can enjoy the park space in a safe manner and with social distance, I think is important. But I think as we look at this, I think there is incredible opportunity to reallocate how we're using our streets. I would have loved to see some testing on this, but I think, you know, we've also learned a lot from watching other communities go through this. I think in a city like New York that has a lot of population density, sidewalk space at a premium, probably hard to walk down the street without running into people.
12-foot diameter, right?
They have closed down a lot of streets that are adjacent to parks to provide safer access as well. So no movement in Columbus that I'm aware of, but I encourage everyone to look at those examples, and hopefully we can learn from those and make some improvements here, because I really feel like this is something that's going to be with us in some shape or form for some time.
So maybe a quick summary. I think obviously there's a push and an urge to do something immediately, and I think we all understand that. The time may be passing a little bit on that. I think our recommendation as planners or the communities should be thinking about some kind of metrics about how you would prioritize where this happens. I still would encourage communities to do that, to take the time to do that, because I think, again, like we've been saying, if things get worse in the fall or at some point in the future, we may be back to this, and it'll be another opportunity. And if we have the metrics in place, I think we can respond more quickly than we did this last time.
Great. Somewhat related, I received an email yesterday afternoon from the director of planning at the city of Dayton, Todd Kinski, who also happens to be an APA Ohio board member. And the reason why I say is it's somewhat related is that the city of Dayton just put together guidelines and regulations to address the desire to expand patios on private property and into right-of-ways. They developed this in conjunction with the Downtown Dayton Partnership and the Health Department, and it's a pretty comprehensive guide, and I took a look at it just briefly, and it's got a lot of really good information in it. We're going to be posting this. We have, just so that all of you know, we have I'm calling it COVID resources. Just articles, webinars. This webinar here that we're doing is also, it's recorded and it's going to be posted. If you head over to ohioplanning.org, the main section of our homepage, you'll see that we have a big link to what we call COVID resources. So the guidelines and regulations that the city of Dayton just put out, those are going to be posted there along with this webinar. So I figured, since I just got this email and it was kind of related, I thought I would give a quick plug for it, because it's some good information.
That's great. Yeah, there's lots of great EPA and resources. And that's really what these are all about, is sharing our knowledge with each other.
Exactly. And if all of you on the line, if you have great resources, you know, related to just kind of everything that we're dealing with right now, please feel free to send it to us. All of our contact info is on ohioplanning.org, and we'll post it also to our COVID resources. Okay, our next question: has Columbus taken any explicit actions in terms of promoting, prioritizing, or mandating equitable investment in public spaces and connectivity networks? And aside from Columbus, are you aware of any other examples from Ohio?
That's a great question. I don't know if we're off the top of our head.
Yeah, so that's part of the implementation of the land plan, and it's not quite 100% underway yet, but we have what's known as a parkland dedication ordinance that, gosh, is probably close to 20 plus years old at this point, that is being updated by the city right now. So that is aimed toward helping these neighborhoods, take advantage of the fact that there's residential development taking place. As new development takes place, that there's money set aside for the provision of parks and open space. So I think that is one way, that is one tool. But again, when you look at what's available in the dollars that have been raised by that ordinance, it's not even enough to build more than a handful of parks, and it takes time for that, for those funds to accrue and be usable. So that's one tool of many that's going to be necessary. I think as we look ahead, we're going to have to look at I think the funding of our park systems in a more creative way, to be able to accomplish some of the lofty goals that we have in the land plan. So it's going to take a lot of different tools and a lot of different partners in order to make that happen. It may be greater cooperation regionally in order to do that. The image you're looking at here in this Q&A slide is sort of a mixture of public and private partnerships to improve the riverfront. But they also used just a little bit upriver here at North Bank Park, which is sort of the start of the downtown chain of riverfront parks. That used TIF funding from the Arena District development to help pay for that park. So it's going to take multiple creative sources of funding to achieve those goals that are laid out in the land plan.
So again, I think this is a great opportunity for all of us to share with each other what we know is going on and great best practices. I think it's clear over the last several months, and again, kind of the heart of this presentation, that there's kind of a three-step at least process. We need to be listening to the communities where we're talking about. We need to hear the individual communities' desires and wishes and what will make them comfortable and will meet their needs. We need to hear that. We need to basically put together metrics and data like Andrew's showing you here, we've done in Columbus, so we understand where the breaks and the gaps are and who's underserved. And then we need to talk about how we prioritize funding and actually how we increase funding or clever ways of getting land to be dedicated in the right places for parks and open space.
Okay, next question. This is a good one. Do you think healthcare institutions would be receptive to the notion of parks as medicine? How can they be brought in to help fund these types of things as they prescribe outdoor exercise, walking, fresh air? I know at least over here, like at the Cleveland Clinic, all of the employees, there's all kinds of credits and things that they can get for walking outside and for their health insurance. And is there a way, or has this already happened, where our larger healthcare institutions can partner with parks either for their employees or their patients?
Yeah, I think that's a huge opportunity. I know, yeah, it is being done. I know Scott Ulrich over at Columbus Public Health has held things. I think it's called Walk with the Doc, and then there's a Parks RX program. I think that's app-based that doctors can use to prescribe exercise, not just prescribe exercise, but exactly where you can go in your neighborhood to go for a walk.
And even track
what you do. Exactly, track what you do, and you get those reward points and all those sorts of things. But I think, in our experience, some of these efforts have been in fits and starts. I'm not aware of anything in the cities we work in where something has really stuck and worked well. I know we're working with the Great Parks of Hamilton County down in Cincinnati right now, and they've had relationships with health systems in the past, but again, nothing that was long lasting. So I do think there's a huge opportunity for this. I think hospital systems, health systems understand this. I think they get it. I think we need to find some way to sort of make these things work in the long run. And that's going to take some greater cooperation. It's probably going to take creating a position in a park system that does nothing but try and foster those relationships. I think some of it is sort of how we're used to doing business right now and the types of positions that we have. I think having someone that's focused on that maybe would help. But I do think there's a distinct and direct connection. I think there's interest in this, and I think there's some things we can look at. I think the Park RX is app-based. I would encourage you guys to look it up. It's pretty cool. I know some parks systems are using this across the country. There was a presentation about this at APA the year before last. So that system looks, I think, really cool.
So I guess just a quick summary again. I think there's a great opportunity for this. I think there are things happening. I think they're fragmented. I think some of our public health agencies are working hard on this. I think it's about us sharing this message more broadly and pulling in things like insurers and coordinating with hospitals and medical providers and getting a broader coalition and figuring out how we really kind of level this up.
Okay, so I think we need to get Scott here on the line with the two of you and
Yeah.
have another webcast just to discuss this one.
I know
Okay.
Scott's a great example. They're definitely doing things.
Right. Yeah. And Scott's been around too. He's a planner living in the public health world. So
Great. We need more.
right. Okay. I think you guys, it's 1 o'clock. It's time to wrap up. This was a lot of fun, and we still have a bunch of questions that we didn't get to. So folks, feel free to reach out to Andrew or Chris. I don't think their emails are on here, but if you head over to MKSK, I assume you can find them, or just kind of Google them.
You should be able to find them. It's basically
Okay.
our first initial, last name at MKSKstudios, that's plural.com.
Okay, awesome. So again, we are recording this. We're going to post it on our YouTube channel. So we have a YouTube channel. The Central Ohio section actually has their own playlist because this is the first of a series of webinars that they're going to be doing. And we'll also post this on our website, ohioplanning.org. And you all don't forget, who need it, you can log, I think, one CM credit for this bad boy. So thanks you all for joining, and thank you to the Central Ohio section for hosting this, and to Chris and Andrew over at MKSK. Everyone, hey, stay safe, and we'll talk next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.